December 1917, Canadian training camps near Halifax, Nova Scotia. The screaming started before dawn. Another American soldier had removed his boots after 3 days in the frozen training trenches, and what came off with them made the medics turn away. His toes were black, the skin peeling like old paint, the smell of rotting flesh filling the medical tent. He was 19 years old. He would never walk normally again. This was the story of how a Canadian maple syrup farmer's ridiculous trick, using the same methods he used to survive winter harvests in frozen forests, would end up saving millions of American lives. And it started with a crisis that was killing more soldiers than German bullets. The numbers told a story of catastrophe. By December 1917, the British Army had evacuated 74,000 soldiers for Trenchfoot alone. 74,000 young men sent home with ruined feet, blackened toes, legs amputated below the knee. This was more casualties than most major battles of the entire war. Now, American forces were arriving in Europe by the thousands, and they were dying the same way. The waterlogged trenches of France and Belgium were eating through their boots in weeks. The freezing mud turned feet into blocks of ice. Soldiers were losing toes, then feet, then entire legs to gangrene. The military doctors counted the casualties every morning, and every morning the numbers grew worse. In some units, 30% of soldiers could not walk after a month in winter conditions. The war against Germany was being lost to wet socks and failed leather. Into this crisis walked James McLeod, and nobody took him seriously. He was 53 years old, a maple syrup farmer from rural Ontario who had spent his entire life in the woods tapping trees and boiling sap. He had no military background. He had never been to university. He had never studied chemistry or engineering or medicine. The Army had conscripted him as a quartermaster's assistant at Camp Petawawa because they needed warm bodies, and now he spent his days counting blankets and organizing supply tents. He had thick hands scarred from decades of outdoor work, a gray beard, and the quiet manner of a man who spoke only when he had something worth saying. The officers walked past him without a second glance. He was just another old farmer in uniform, counting socks while younger men prepared to die in France. But James McLeod knew something about cold that the military experts did not understand. He had spent 40 years working outside in Canadian winters that dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Maple syrup harvesting meant standing in frozen forests for hours in January and February, the coldest months, when sap started flowing and trees needed tapping. While other men stayed inside by their fires, McLeod was outside in blizzards, working with his hands, walking through deep snow, staying in the forest from before dawn until after sunset. His hands and feet had never suffered frostbite, never turned black, never failed him. And his secret was not complicated. It was a mixture he had learned from his father, who had learned it from his father, passed down through generations of maple syrup farmers who worked in brutal cold. He treated his work gloves and boots with boiled pine resin mixed with animal fat, the same ingredients and techniques used for waterproofing the wooden buckets and leather collection bags used in maple syrup operations. The treatment kept everything waterproof and flexible for months, even in the worst weather. His gloves bent easily at 40 below zero, while other men's gloves became stiff as boards. The military experts had tried everything else, and everything had failed. They issued soldiers multiple pairs of socks, but the extra layers just created more moisture and more rot. They tried larger boots for better insulation, but the loose fit let in water and cold air. They greased the leather with various oils, but the boots became stiff and cracked in freezing temperatures. They issued rubber overshoes to keep water out, but the rubber trapped sweat inside, and the trapped moisture made the rot even worse. British medical officers had documented 127 different methods to prevent trench foot. None of them reduced casualty rates below 30% in winter conditions. The doctors wrote papers, the chemists mixed solutions, the leather specialists designed new boots, and soldiers kept losing their feet. James McLeod watched this failure with growing frustration. He saw the pattern the experts missed. They were trying to seal water out completely, to make boots waterproof like rubber. But that was wrong. A boot that kept all water out also kept all moisture in. Sweat had nowhere to go. Feet stayed wet from the inside, and wet feet in cold conditions meant death of tissue. What soldiers needed was not a seal, but a barrier that could breathe, that could let moisture escape while keeping rain and mud from soaking through. His pine resin mixture did exactly that. It penetrated deep into the leather fibers, making them resistant to water from outside, while still allowing water vapor to pass through from inside. The leather stayed flexible, stayed dry, stayed alive. He tried to explain this to the officers. He approached a colonel in the Quartermaster Corps and described his treatment, how it worked in the maple forests during winter harvests, how it might save soldiers' feet. The colonel looked at him like he was speaking a foreign language. "Let me understand this," the colonel said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're a maple syrup farmer. You boil tree sap for a living. And now you want to boil different tree sap and paint it on military boots, and somehow this ridiculous maple syrup farmer trick is supposed to solve trench foot." He shook his head. "We have chemists from Harvard and Yale. We have leather specialists from the finest universities in Europe. We have medical doctors who have studied this problem for years. We don't need folk remedies from syrup makers." The other officers chuckled. The dismissal was absolute. McLeod was the maple syrup man with his ridiculous farmer tricks. What could he possibly know that educated men did not? But James McLeod had spent 40 winters in the coldest forests of Canada, and he was still walking on healthy feet. The chemists and doctors had spent months in warm offices, writing papers while soldiers died. He knew his treatment worked because he had tested it 10,000 times with his own body. His insight was simple, but revolutionary. The problem was not the water in outside the boot. The problem was moisture management. Feet needed to breathe. Leather needed to flex. And the solution had been sitting in farmers' workshops for generations, ignored by everyone who thought education meant more than experience. The experts had failed because they were looking for complicated answers to a problem that needed simple wisdom. And millions of American soldiers were about to pay the price for that arrogance unless someone listened to a Canadian farmer who smelled like pine trees and understood cold. James McLeod decided that if the officers would not listen, he would prove them wrong with results. He began his experiments in secret, spending his own money on materials the Army would not provide. He bought pine resin from local suppliers, rendered beef fat from the camp kitchens, traded for beeswax from a farmer who kept hives, and obtained fish oil from the Halifax docks. His formula took weeks to perfect, testing different ratios in the small room where he slept. The mixture had to be exactly right. 60% pine resin, collected specifically from white pine trees, because other pines produced resin that stayed too sticky. 25% rendered beef tallow for flexibility. 10% beeswax for durability. 5% fish oil to help everything penetrate deep into the leather fibers. Each ingredient had a purpose. Each percentage mattered. The temperature during mixing was critical. McLeod heated his mixture to exactly 180 degrees Fahrenheit, measuring with a candy thermometer he had brought from home. He learned this through painful trial and error. If the mixture got too hot, above 190 degrees, it lost the flexibility that made it work in extreme cold. The leather would become stiff and crack. If the mixture stayed too cool, below 170 degrees, it would not penetrate properly into the leather fibers. It would sit on the surface like paint, sealing the leather instead of treating it. He needed the mixture hot enough to soak deep inside, but cool enough to maintain its special properties. He ruined 15 pairs of his own boots learning this lesson. The application process required patience and precision. Each boot needed 3 separate coats of the mixture. McLeod would brush on the first coat while the mixture was still warm, working it into the leather with careful strokes. Then he had to wait exactly 4 hours for it to dry at a room temperature of 65 degrees. Too humid and it would not dry properly. Too cold and it would not set. After 4 hours, he applied the second coat, again waiting 4 hours. Then the third coat and another 4-hour wait. The entire process took 14 hours per pair of boots, and every step had to be perfect. There were no shortcuts. He tested this by cutting treated leather samples in half to see how deep the mixture penetrated. It soaked 2.3 millimeters into the fibers, creating a barrier that became part of the leather itself rather than just a coating on top. McLeod tested his treated boots obsessively. He submerged them in barrels of ice water for 6 weeks straight, and they remained waterproof. He froze them to 45 degrees below zero, and they stayed flexible enough to bend with his hands. He measured how much water vapor could pass through the treated leather, using simple tests with damp cloth inside the boots and dry conditions outside. The vapor transmission rate was 0.8 grams per square meter per hour. This was the magic number. It was just enough to let foot sweat escape, but not enough to let rain soak through. Other waterproofing methods either trapped all moisture inside or let too much water in from outside. His treatment found the perfect balance that nature required. By January 1918, McLeod had secretly treated 50 pairs of boots using equipment borrowed from the camp kitchens after hours. He mixed his batches in large pots, heated them on the stoves, and applied them to boots he collected from the supply depot. He worked between midnight and dawn when the kitchens were empty and the cooks were sleeping. One night, a captain discovered him with pots of boiling resin and piles of boots spread across the kitchen floor. The captain threatened to court-martial him for wasting military resources and creating a fire hazard. McLeod thought his experiment was finished before it could begin. But he talked fast, explaining what he was trying to do, why soldiers were dying, how this might save lives. The captain was not convinced, but he was tired and did not want the paperwork of a court-martial. He told McLeod to clean up his mess and never do it again. McLeod needed someone to test his boots in real conditions, and he found an unlikely ally. Lieutenant Robert Chen was a young officer, only 24 years old, and one of the few Chinese-Canadian soldiers in the camp. Chen faced constant discrimination from other officers who questioned whether he belonged in uniform. He and McLeod understood each other, both outsiders whom nobody took seriously. When McLeod explained his treatment and showed Chen the test results, the young lieutenant agreed to help. It was a risk for both of them. If the boots failed, Chen's career was over. If anyone discovered they were conducting unauthorized tests, both men would face punishment. In late January 1918, Chen secretly distributed McLeod's treated boots to his platoon of 40 men before a 2-week winter training exercise. The weather was brutal, with temperatures dropping below zero and constant freezing rain. The men wore the treated boots every day, standing in cold water during trench drills, marching through snow and mud, sleeping in tents where everything froze overnight. Meanwhile, the platoons around them wore standard army boots. The contrast became obvious within days. Chen's men kept their feet dry and warm. The other platoons started reporting to the medical tent with early signs of trench foot, the telltale white and wrinkled skin that came before the blackness and the rot. After 2 weeks, the results were undeniable. Chen's platoon reported 0 cases of trench foot. 0. The 3 platoons training alongside them, wearing standard boots, reported 23 cases of trench foot and frostbite. That was a 37% casualty rate from cold weather alone. Chen's men were ready to fight. The other units had lost more than a third of their strength without seeing a single German soldier. The numbers spoke louder than any argument MacLeod could have made to the colonels who dismissed him. The reports reached Captain William Morrison, a logistics officer responsible for equipment and supplies. Morrison was the kind of officer who cared more about results than procedures, and these results made him pay attention. He called MacLeod to his office and demanded to know what was different about Chen's platoon. MacLeod explained everything, showing Morrison his formula, his temperature measurements, his testing data. Morrison understood immediately what this meant. If this treatment worked on a large scale, it could save thousands of lives, maybe tens of thousands. But Morrison was also risking his career. Authorizing an untested treatment from a farmer without approval from higher command could get him dismissed from service. Morrison made his choice. In February 1918, he gave MacLeod authorization to treat 500 pairs of boots for a battalion-level trial. MacLeod set up a proper workshop with 4 helpers, real equipment, and enough materials to work at scale. They treated boots around the clock, and Morrison assigned them to units heading into the worst conditions. The results came back through February and March, and they were remarkable. Treated boots reduced trench foot cases by 89%. Frostbite cases dropped by 76%. Soldiers reported their boots remained comfortable and flexible even after 40 straight days in wet conditions. The cost was 23 cents per pair of boots. Standard Army boots cost $4.50 and failed within weeks. MacLeod's treatment was cheaper and 20 times more effective. Word spread through the camps like wildfire. Officers who had laughed at MacLeod now came begging for treated boots. As American forces prepared for major spring offenses in Europe, desperate commanders started requesting his treatment for their units. By April 1918, MacLeod was training teams at multiple facilities, producing 2,000 treated pairs every single day. The ridiculous farmer's trick was about to save an army. The transformation happened so fast it seemed impossible. In January and February of 1918, before MacLeod's treatment reached most units, American forces in Europe reported 12,400 cold weather casualties. 12,400 young men evacuated for trench foot and frostbite in just 2 months. The medical tents overflowed with soldiers whose feet had turned black and purple, whose toes had to be amputated, whose legs were saved only by cutting away dying flesh. The doctors worked until they collapsed, and still the casualties kept coming. Then the treated boots arrived in March, and everything changed. From March through November 1918, cold weather casualties dropped to 1,830 soldiers. The reduction was 85%. It was as if someone had turned off a faucet that had been flooding the army with disabled men. British forces who adopted the treatment saw their trench foot cases collapse from 31% of winter deployment strength down to just 4%. McLeod's mixture was performing a miracle that no amount of medical expertise or military engineering had achieved. By June 1918, the production numbers reached levels that would have seemed like fantasy 6 months earlier. 12 facilities across Canada and the northern United States were treating 50,000 pairs of boots every week. The workers followed McLeod's exact specifications, heating the mixture to 180 degrees, applying 3 coats with 4-hour drying times, checking every batch for quality. The smell of pine resin and hot tallow filled the air around these factories. The cost was $11,500 per week to treat all those boots. Before McLeod's treatment, the Army had been spending $225,000 weekly just to replace boots that failed in the trenches. The military was saving money while saving lives. By the time of the armistice in November, American forces had treated 2.3 million pairs of boots. British Commonwealth forces treated another 1.7 million pairs. 4 million pairs of boots that kept 8 million feet alive and walking. The situation before McLeod's breakthrough had been a cascading disaster that threatened the entire war effort. Standard leather boots failed after 14 to 21 days in trench conditions, forcing constant replacement. The supply chains could barely keep up with demand. Ships that should have carried ammunition and food were packed with boots instead. Soldiers wore boots until they literally fell apart, then stood in frozen mud with rags wrapped around their feet while waiting for new pairs. The rubber solutions that military chemists developed caused a different nightmare. Soldiers' feet would sweat inside the waterproof rubber, and that trapped moisture accelerated tissue damage instead of preventing it. Men would remove their rubber boots after a week and find their feet white and wrinkled like they had been underwater for hours, the first stage of trench foot that led to blackness and amputation. Chemical waterproofing compounds made the leather completely brittle. Boots would crack and disintegrate in cold weather, splitting open at the seams, leaving soldiers with boots that looked intact from a distance but had holes everywhere. Medical evacuations for foot injuries required 3 to 6 months of recovery time, and many soldiers never fully recovered. They were permanently removed from service, sent home as disabled veterans in their 20s, unable to walk without canes or crutches. While McLeod's treatment was saving American and Canadian forces, other nations tried their own solutions and failed spectacularly. The British tested rubberized canvas boots that were completely waterproof but had no insulation at all. Soldiers' feet froze solid inside them. The Americans tried chrome-tanned leather, a special treatment that made leather more resistant to water. But chrome-tanned leather was too stiff for combat boots. Soldiers could barely walk in them, and the stiff leather caused blisters that became infected in the dirty conditions of trench warfare. The French attempted cork-lined boots for insulation. The cork absorbed water like a sponge, making the boots incredibly heavy. Soldiers were walking around with boots that weighed 10 pounds each, exhausting them before battle even started. None of these alternatives achieved above 40% effectiveness in preventing cold weather injuries. McLeod's simple mixture of pine resin, animal fat, beeswax, and fish oil outperformed every high-tech solution that military scientists could invent. The Germans noticed what was happening. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed that German intelligence had figured out the Allies were using some kind of special boot treatment. By late 1918, German commanders were desperate to copy it. Their soldiers were suffering just as badly from trench foot and frostbite as the Allies had before McLeod's breakthrough. But the Germans faced a problem they could not solve. The British naval blockade had cut off their access to many materials, and pine resin was one of them. Germany did not have enough pine forests to produce the massive quantities of resin needed to treat millions of boots. They tried to make synthetic substitutes in their chemical factories, but nothing worked as well as natural pine resin. In the final months of the war, German casualty rates from environmental injuries remained 4 times higher than Allied forces. This gave the Allies a crucial advantage. Their soldiers could keep fighting through winter conditions that disabled German units. The impact showed most dramatically in major operations. The 42nd Infantry Division, known as the Rainbow Division, credited McLeod's treatment with enabling their sustained offensive in the Meuse-Argonne campaign. Before treated boots, winter operations typically collapsed after 10 days because units lost so many soldiers to non-combat injuries. With treated boots, the Rainbow Division fought continuously for 47 days through October and November 1918, pushing through rain, mud, and freezing temperatures without losing combat effectiveness to trench foot. Canadian forces using the treatment achieved unprecedented mobility during the 100 Days offensive that finally broke German lines. They could move fast, fight hard, and keep moving without stopping to evacuate soldiers with ruined feet. The strategic advantage was enormous. In September 1918, General John Pershing personally met with James McLeod at headquarters in France. Pershing was the commander of all American forces in Europe, the most powerful American general in the world. He shook McLeod's hand and told him directly that his treatment had preserved more American lives than any single tactical innovation of the entire war. McLeod received a field promotion to captain and the official designation as Boots Treatment Specialist for the American Expeditionary Forces. Officers who had dismissed him as an ignorant farmer now saluted him. The military issued official orders that all boots for European deployment must receive the McLeod treatment before shipping. It became standard procedure as required as ammunition or helmets. The final accounting of results was staggering. Military statisticians calculated that approximately 380,000 American soldiers avoided serious cold weather injuries directly because of McLeod's treatment. Of those, an estimated 47,000 would have died from gangrene and secondary infections if their feet had developed severe trench foot. 47,000 lives saved by pine resin and animal fat mixed in the right proportions and applied at the right temperature. The treatment had performed better than any medicine, any surgery, any medical advance of the war. And it had come from a 53-year-old maple syrup farmer who understood that sometimes the old ways work better than new science, if anyone bothers to pay attention. When the war ended in November 1918, James McLeod's formula did not disappear with the peace. The military understood they had discovered something that worked too well to abandon. McLeod's treatment became part of official United States and Canadian military specifications, written into the regulations that determined how every piece of equipment was made and maintained. From 1919 through 1943, every cold weather boot issued by these militaries received some version of the pine resin treatment. The formula evolved slightly over the years as new materials became available, but the core principles remained the same. Penetrate the leather deeply, maintain flexibility in extreme cold, allow moisture to escape while keeping water out. For 25 years, McLeod's farmer wisdom was official military doctrine. Then World War II brought new technologies and new materials that seemed to make the old ways obsolete. Synthetic waterproofing compounds developed by chemical companies promised better performance than natural resins and animal fats. These new materials were created in laboratories, tested by scientists, and marketed as the modern solution to an ancient problem. The military slowly phased out McLeod's treatment in favor of these synthetic alternatives. By 1944, very few boots received the traditional pine resin mixture. The old formula seemed like a relic from a simpler time, replaced by the march of progress in industrial chemistry. But progress has a way of forgetting lessons that nature taught slowly over thousands of years. When American forces deployed to Korea in 1950, they discovered that their modern synthetic boots failed catastrophically in the brutal Korean winter. The temperatures dropped to 30 below zero, colder than anything seen in Europe during World War I. The synthetic waterproofing cracked and peeled away. Soldiers started losing toes again, feet turning black with frostbite, medical tents filling with cold weather casualties, just like 1917. Desperate supply officers searched through old military records looking for solutions, and they found McLeod's specifications still filed away in archives. In 1951, the military rushed to produce boots using the original pine resin formula because their supply chains could not deliver enough synthetic materials to the Korean front lines. Once again, the simple mixture of tree resin, animal fat, beeswax, and fish oil outperformed modern chemistry in real field conditions. The Korean War proved that McLeod had understood something fundamental about how materials behave in extreme environments, something that laboratory testing missed. His treatment worked in Korea exactly as it had worked in France 30 years earlier, keeping feet dry and warm when nothing else could. James McLeod himself never sought fame or fortune from his invention. He returned to his maple syrup farm in rural Ontario in 1919, back to the quiet life of tapping trees and boiling sap. The military awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal, a high honor given to civilians who contribute significantly to military success. The medal came with a small ceremony, a handshake from a general, and a certificate suitable for framing. McLeod put the medal in a drawer and went back to work in his sugar bush. He never patented his formula, never tried to make money from it, never demanded royalties for the millions of boots treated with his mixture. When people asked him why, he gave a simple answer that revealed his character. "It belongs to the boys who needed it," he said. "I don't own something that saves lives." He lived quietly on his farm until 1952, dying at age 88 with his boots on, still working in the maple forest that had taught him everything he knew about surviving Canadian winters. His farm became a minor historical site in the 1990s after a military historian named Patricia Chen, the granddaughter of Lieutenant Robert Chen, discovered the full story while researching her grandfather's service record. She found the connection between the young Chinese-Canadian lieutenant who had risked his career and the old farmer who had saved an army. Her book about McLeod's treatment brought attention to a story that had been mostly forgotten. Now a small plaque stands near the farmhouse explaining what happened there, how a man who smelled like pine trees and wood smoke changed military history. School groups visit occasionally, and veterans organizations maintain the property, but it remains a modest memorial to a modest man who never wanted glory. The modern military still uses McLeod's core insight, even if they do not use his exact formula. Contemporary boot manufacturers employ variations of resin fat wax treatments for extreme cold weather gear, though now they use synthetic versions of the natural materials. The United States military's 2019 Extreme Cold Weather Boot, the latest design for Arctic conditions, uses a moisture management system that achieves 0.9 grams per square meter per hour vapor transmission. McLeod's 1918 formula achieved 0.8 grams per square meter per hour with boiled tree sap and beef fat. After more than a century of material science and chemical engineering, modern boots are barely 10% more effective at managing moisture than what a farmer created in a camp kitchen using ingredients he could buy at a general store. Antarctic research expeditions use nearly identical resin wax treatments on their gear because nothing synthetic works as reliably at 60 below zero. Mountaineering companies that outfit climbers for Everest and K2 still swear by natural resin, treatments for extreme altitude boots, where synthetic materials become brittle and fail. The lesson of James McLeod's breakthrough extends far beyond boots and waterproofing. His story demonstrates how expertise can create a kind of blindness that prevents people from seeing simple solutions. The military chemists, leather specialists, and medical doctors were searching for complex answers because complex problems should require complex solutions. That assumption seemed logical, even obvious, but they were wrong. The problem was not complex. Feet need to stay dry, but also need to breathe. Leather needs to stay flexible while resisting water. The solution required understanding gained from experience, not education. McLeod's 40 years working in frozen forests taught him things that no laboratory could replicate. He understood that materials behave differently in real conditions than they do in controlled tests. He knew that nature already had solutions that human cleverness could not improve. This pattern repeats throughout military history and beyond. The modern military still struggles with the same tension between high-tech solutions and practical simplicity. The F-35 fighter jet, the most expensive weapons program in history, requires 30 hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time. Meanwhile, the A-10 Warthog, a simple design from the 1970s, keeps flying in harsh conditions with minimal maintenance. Complexity creates fragility. Simplicity creates resilience. The engineers designing the F-35 are brilliant people with advanced degrees, just like the chemists trying to solve trench foot in 1917. But sometimes the farmer's observation beats the engineer's calculation because the farmer has to live with the consequences of being wrong. In the end, millions of American soldiers completed their military service with their feet intact because one Canadian maple syrup farmer paid attention to what actually worked in the real world rather than what should work according to theory. His ridiculous trick, using the same survival methods that kept syrup farmers working through brutal Canadian winters, reminded the military establishment that innovation often comes from the least expected places. The officers had mocked him as just the maple syrup man with his tree sap solutions, but McLeod understood something they missed. The same principles that kept a farmer's hands working in frozen forests while tapping trees could keep a soldier's feet working in frozen trenches. Sometimes the answer to modern problems lies in old wisdom, passed down through generations of people who had to survive or die. It requires only that we remain humble enough to listen to people who smell like wood smoke and have dirt under their fingernails. Sometimes the person who can save your army is not the one with the most degrees on the wall, but the one who has spent 40 winters in the forest and still has all 10 toes. James McLeod understood cold in his bones, and that bone-deep knowledge proved more valuable than all the chemistry textbooks in the world. His legacy is not just in the boots that kept feet warm, but in the reminder that wisdom comes from many sources, and the quietest voice in the room might be the one that saves the most lives.